on Monday. Let's bring the conversation right now, senior fellow with the FDD, Sinan Ciddi. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And this is a stark warning from Central Command saying that Iran is kind of shooting off rockets and missiles from densely populated areas. What do we make of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic sort of Iranian strategy, right? Because it wants to disencourage the United States from essentially retaliating into Iran where civilians are located. But this we've seen in other sort of Iran proxy entities. Hamas was doing the same thing inside of Gaza, essentially having positions inside of the country or inside of the strip, I should say, where they were, where it was densely populated with civilians, trying to disencourage the Israeli military from striking back. But this is essentially one part of the Iranian strategy. Another one of this is essentially what you're seeing is they're striking densely populated civilian areas inside of the Gulf states in an attempt to essentially pressure the Gulf states to implore the United States to end the war.
How much of a change of strategy is this? Because we've seen it in the Middle East, the war there, Israel and Hamas, some of those targets, they're accused Israel of Hamas having them over hospitals and the kind. What does this strategy signify from Iran to say they potentially might be shooting these off next to civilians?
I mean, look, this is part of the sort of authoritarian playbook. I mean, countries such as Iran, North Korea, these are sort of, countries that do not respect the rules and engagement of war, simply because for them, either using human shields in the form of their own civilians or striking in enemy territory civilian targets is their game, simply because they think that this will result in pressure being applied to the government of the United States here, or previously in the case of Israel, whereby they're going to essentially say, look, this war has to stop because they're targeting civilians. They're banking on the fact that what they're attempting to do is going to put undue pressure on governments to stop this war.
Yeah, and obviously pressure on terms of other civilians, just the innocent around there. And this is a live picture one more time there in Beirut. And we also know that Iran's war targets widened dangerously into civilian infrastructure on Sunday as Bahrain accused Iran of striking one of the desalination plants that are crucial for the Gulf nation's drinking waters. And we talk about the region there, but I don't know if people really understand the complexity or the importance of some of those plants. Can you speak to that? How important are those? And again, back to the strategy of why exactly they're targeting this and just the basis of it.
Right. I mean, typical targets that we would expect, or what our listeners or observers would expect, is Iran's going to strike sort of things like oil depots, airports, which they're already potentially targeting. And in the case of the Emirates, obviously, they're doing that. But what we underestimate as a general public is Iran's resolve and willingness to strike critical infrastructure to the Gulf states. Simply because if you strike a desalination plant in a country like the Emirates or Israel or any other of the Gulf states which rely on desalinizing water for drinking and actual circulation, this will absolutely cripple the countries. I mean, they would have no drinking water or city water that we're accustomed to. The United States, we're not, used to having desalinated water as our main sort of water supply. We have reserves in natural resources. These countries do not. And in the case that Iran really goes out to sort of precision target civilian infrastructure, this will decimate essentially civilian security in having access to clean drinking water supplies. And they're going to go after other targets too, electricity plants, any other sort of critical infrastructure, which is for them not off the books.
Yeah, that is a good way to describe it because it's so very crucial for the populations of those countries and the neighbors, like you mentioned, being hammered, being pummeled by this. Is there anything we're hearing in terms of response? Are they awaiting the United States to step in? What are they doing about this as Bahrain gets potentially hit about this civilian infrastructure plant?
I mean, we saw in the case of the UAE that they're willing to essentially now enter combat operations against Iran. That I wouldn't be surprised if other countries feel the pressure. But, as far as the United States and Iran is concerned, both are looking at this from a perspective of how much firepower does Iran have, the IRGC have, to continue this sort of barrage of hitting civilian or military infrastructure. They have a limited number and supply of ballistic missiles, and those are being drained by the day, and their ability to replenish and restock those is not very opportune simply because they're in a war footing. But so the United States has been, and Israel has been striking their launch capabilities. And it doesn't matter at one level how many missiles Iran has. If they can't launch them because these launches are being targeted and destroyed, that's going to cut down their time. But also for the US and Israel, one also has to say a critical sort of worry and thing that we're watching out for is we have a limited supply of offensive ballistic and missile capabilities, which are also being drawn down. And we also want to watch for that. So this is a numbers game at some level.
Yeah, that is so very true. Obviously, taking out some of those interceptors, taking out some of those sites are an objective the Secretary Hegseth has laid ground. I also want to talk about other points because the atrocity that happened at the girls' school in Iran, evidence suggests that the deadly blast at that elementary school was likely a U.S. airstrike. We heard last night aboard Air Force One that Hegseth said they were investigating, President Trump saying it was Iran. How did they go about determining what exactly led to this? Who was actually responsible?
Yeah, that's a very good and tough question to answer because Iran will have no problem in just saying, look, this was a calculated and intentional strike to kill children and civilians, whereas the United States has a historic record for attempting to be judicious about which targets it does strike and being accountable for those. We have numerous redundancies. We have numerous checks and balances that go into essentially how we target and strike our enemy. But the problem with that is obviously this is a widespread war. And, I don't want to throw this as a throwaway comment, but mistakes do happen. And the United States is not in the business of targeting civilian structures, least of all schools where children are housed. But if it did happen, I'm sure there'll be a thorough investigation and hopefully accountability for how that mistake took place.
And potentially another reason why Central Command posted that today, warning civilians in Iran, talking about that they might be, the IRGC, using it alongside some of these critical infrastructure points. Speaking to that, though, you mentioned that this potentially might be close to a target for the United States. And we're talking about precision. And when you talk about the U.S. military, that they're very, very precise, does that indicate that it may not be the United States just by the fact that it was a missed target location? Would that potentially indicate that it was Iran?
So that's, again, another good question. I mean, we've seen a considerable amount of disinformation and a polluted information space in this war because it is a war. And given that we're in the age of artificial intelligence and, it would not surprise me if Iran essentially used as a sort of false flag point. And I'd be very surprised if they did that because they would be striking their own children. But obviously, there is the Israeli Air Force to consider here in terms of right now, we don't have a clear idea of where to attribute the origin of this strike that came from. My bet would still be on the fact that this is a mistake. Like I said, the United States, we have a rich history. Our military is well versed and well schooled in the rules of engagement and what principles of just war are. And we are not in the business of striking civilian targets, especially schools, hospitals, simply because we think that might give us a military advantage. That is not how we do things. And so I'm willing to extend the U.S. military, an extended sort of line of credit simply because we have strong rules of accountability that we don't do that on purpose.
And they said they're going to look into it, a thorough investigation into actually what transpired there. President Trump saying it's Iran at this atrocity, killing hundreds of young children at that elementary school. I also want to ask, because we do know that the United States, in collaboration with Israel, took out the supreme leader and others in that major strike initially, the Operation Epic Fury, and we know that they're working to elect a new leader, potentially already in the works, indications saying that on the ground. Will we have any indication who exactly that is? Because the United States and Israel both likely to go after that specific target. What would a new supreme leader, who may they be, and how will the U.S. and Israel try to target them?
Yes, I think one of the things to underscore here is the potential for Iran to essentially determine who their next leader is going to be. So at the spiritual level, we have to remember that the supreme leader is more powerful than the president of the country. The IRGC is directly accountable to them. And so in terms of continuity of power and government in Iran or for the Islamic Republic, this is a critical sort of choice for them right now. What I would say is this. There are a number of names being floated around there, not least of all the late leader Khamenei's son, but there are other contenders in there too. Rather than fixate on a name and what that would mean, I would also stress that what makes this sort of war particularly difficult for the United States and Israel and any other country that's potentially interested in seeing the Islamic regime fail is, unlike other conflicts that we've seen that the United States engaged in recently, such as Venezuela, or potentially when we took out the regime in Iraq back in 2003, Iran has a quite rigid and strong institutional response to continuity. They have prepared for this, and they're very much indicating this too. We may have taken out the top leaderships up until this point, but as far as we can see and determine, governance and the ability of continuity of government in Iran, in the Islamic Republic, seems to be holding up, which is a major challenge. If our intention is to see the demise of the Islamic regime, the intention should be to not necessarily fixate on who the leader is, but we actually have to bring down the apparatus of the IRGC and the girders that support and buttress this regime.
Yeah, and we heard from earlier this week President Trump saying he wants a hand in particularly picking who might be the next leader. And if they already selected it, you might imagine that's not the case, not something that they are in line with. I do want to ask you, because we talk about them potentially not necessarily a single person, just a kind of the construct of the IRGC. We talked about the United States. Their objective isn't a regime change, but depending on who they pick, do you think that could change if it's someone that is in line with the Ayatollah, that is the son of the Ayatollah? Do you think the objectives for the United States, for Israel, might change?
It depends. I mean, I would say that the United States' position on the continuity and the longevity of this war is, as of yet, undetermined. I think we have a relative degree of flexibility as to what we intend as a good outcome or what we would like to see, whereas our Israeli allies are obviously much more fixated on actually bringing down this regime for the good of the region. And that's not necessarily a wrong sort of desire or strategy to pursue. Ours is a little bit more flexible. I think depending on if the United States sort of puts a position behind its preference, or somebody that's elected that's completely antithetical to what the United States would prefer to have the new government or the continuity of government in Iran. One thing to watch out for, I would suggest, is whether that new governance structure that succeeds the late Khamenei and his sort of elites, which a large number of which have been eliminated, whether that sort of new ruling elite would be willing to sort of sit down at the negotiating table with the United States and make some very hard choices, things that they do not want to countenance. One of which I would say are on the three pillars. One is a complete abandonment of their nuclear program. Secondly, the abandonment of their ballistic missile program, as well as cutting ties and end of supply and supply and enabling of its regional proxies. If they were willing to do that, that could come pretty close to what President Trump has referred to as unconditional surrender.
All right, very good. That would be obviously a win for the United States. I also want to put this up here from Bloomberg TV talking about this. Iran's Assembly of Experts has elected the country's new leader, signing a council member. They didn't name the council's pick, but they said, quote, the leadership election has been completed and the supreme leader has been determined. And over the last week, since Operation Epic Fury was underway, we talked a lot about the capabilities of Iran and the IRGC, or really the lack thereof. And it's been scattered, attacking neighbors in the region. We've seen their stockpile or their usage of missiles and drones go down day by day by day. With the fact that there might be a leader, do you think there might be a more unified kind of response from Iran? Is that a concern the United States might have?
It's possible, yeah. I mean, look, the regime is up against the fence. They're cornered and they are taking an absolute pummeling, a shellacking, in another vernacular form. And survival is the name of the game. I mean, right now, what they're doing is something that the regime has essentially tried to prepare for the last 45 years, which is regime survival, right? At all costs. They're not really concerned about what happens to the civilian population. They're not really concerned about the economic toll of this. What they want to do is to ensure continuity and survival such that when the day comes, maybe the United States and Israel are essentially beleaguered. They don't necessarily have the public resolve behind them to continue this war. And Iran's game at this point would be to essentially get these two countries, if not other countries, to join the war, to come to the table. And that's the name of the game. But one thing that we should say is, look, it's a dangerous business in Iran being named the successor leader in any sort of capacity. We saw this with their proxy networks in Hezbollah and Hamas. You can name successors, but this doesn't seem to be a sort of career path that has a great amount of time of survivability, and it doesn't seem to be a good career choice because Israel has a track record of eliminating them. And their intelligence penetration of the country as well as ours is quite extensive. And so whether they get to the table at one point is one thing, but also surviving to get to the table is probably another problem that they're running against.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Obviously, Israel targeting so many of these different leaders, like you mentioned, those proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, they've been targeting that using their intelligence alongside the U.S. In a grand way. I want to ask you about another component of this, because we heard earlier on this week, potentially the Kurds getting involved, and we were kind of understanding exactly the Kurdish region, what an uprising might look like. President Trump wary of necessarily getting them involved, the Kurds, Iraqi Kurds, Iranian Kurds, not selling. They're going to cross the border. What would an uprising look like? What's the latest? Can you tell us on that?
Yes, this idea was floated and considered presumably in the last week or so, because we saw multiple news sources, incredible ones, reporting that, as in something that the United States tried back in the sort of first Gulf War with the George Bush Sr., which essentially encouraged. I would say in the Iran-Iraq war, where the U.S. administration at the time encouraged Kurds to rise up simply because this was seen to be a means to sort of counterbalance their adversaries. And one of the things that we've seen considered, whether it was under Israeli pressure or the United States considering it, is for the Kurds right now across the region, but mainly Iranian Kurds, as a pretext to essentially sort of foment and initiate an armed uprising that would essentially take down the regime physically. Because right now, we're relying on an aerial campaign to essentially just bomb the regime out of existence, which I'm being told by military analysts is essentially not a way to essentially reach that goal. But the problem with operationalizing the Kurds in this case, regardless of their origin, is this is going to raise potential red flags with regional countries. I will just give you one: the Republic of Turkey, which is immediate sort of Western neighbor to Iran. It's no fan of the regime necessarily, although they would like it to remain in some sort of shape to govern Iran. If a Kurdish insurgency is mounted inside of Iran, Turkey will possibly consider that as a red line and use that as an opportunity to enter Iran militarily, because they're worried about the Iranians inside of Iran, the Kurds inside of Iran, of establishing Kurdish state and essentially dismember Iran. And for the Turks, that's a big worry, because that entity, the Kurdish entity, is likely to have significant backing from what Turkey considers to be Kurdish separatists and terrorists. And it's had the same problem inside of its borders. And the second problem it has that we run up against is if we wanted to back a Kurdish uprising to take down the regime in Iran, look, there are a lot of people inside of Iran, and not necessarily, Kurdish or Iranian. It's multi-ethnic and multi-denominational, and there would be a significant opposition potentially inside of Iran that would basically coalesce maybe around the regime to put down a Kurdish uprising, and that would not serve anybody's interest, which probably helps explain the president's choice right now to essentially not back a Kurdish insurgency.
Yeah, that is interesting. It feels like the Kurds kind of between a rock and a hard place there, where they're the uprising in Iran, which they could kind of fear retaliation of what's going on there in Turkey. If they were to get involved, how would it look? Would the United States be aiding in this? How would they go about it if it were to come to fruition?
Difficult to say, because it hasn't really come into sort of being considered as a serious plan. But if some of the stories are true that we've been reading about in the sort of more credible outlets that we're in the US, it seems to suggest that the Israelis and the Americans on the level of intelligence have been providing material assistance, weapons and training to Iranian Kurds for some months now. And what would that look like if we decided to mount a Kurdish offensive? Well, I think I would say, look at past experience. We have a good track record of backing the Ukrainian military, which is a strategy is essentially leading from behind. But we've also essentially, partnered up as a country, the United States, for at least its part, in backing the Syrian Kurds under the banner of the Syrian Democratic Forces, beginning in the mid-2010s, to essentially fight against the Islamic State. We provided targeting information, military assistance, logistical as well as weaponry, right? And that's presumably what it would look like. But I should say, the Iranian case is actually going to be very difficult if this is an option that they choose for. I mean, if anybody looks at a topographic map of Iran, mountainous, Iran is a very, very mountainous country. If we are going to essentially mount a sort of infantry option to try and take down the regime, as in, armed, ground fighters, and those are the Kurds, and we sort of, the intention is to sort of get them into Iran through the Iraqi border, you're running up against huge obstacles in geographic terrain in terms of getting them to march on regime strongholds. But just another factor to bear in mind.
Yeah, that is a very good, obviously, just such an expansive location. I don't think people in the United States just understand how mountainous, how large Iran is, especially in terms of being on the ground there. Sinan, anything else you're monitoring? What else are you focusing on this week? Because we're now well into a week beyond the initiation of Operation Epic Fury. What else are you keeping your eye on this week?
Well, I think it depends what you pick up. I'm very curious about to seeing what other sort of Western allies that the United States may essentially sort of motivate and gain in actually committing military resources or cooperation. We do know that the UK is considering, if not already deployed or willing to deploy, some valuable assets in the form of aircraft carriers because of the Iranian strike on Cyprus, on the British base there. We are looking for, I'm essentially on the watch out to see if the United States can motivate more allies to essentially back the government's attempt to bring down the regime. But I'm also watching out on the domestic scene in the United States. I mean, in terms of like how will political opinion, public opinion sort of evolve around this conflict as gas prices continue to be challenged by this conflict and other economic indicators.
I was going to ask you about that because you talk about motivation for other countries back here at home, and it feels like that is a part of the Iranian strategy to make the United States, make Americans feel this. How might that happen, especially if they continue to say they've closed the Strait of Hormuz, they're continuing to potentially attack vessels off that region? We talk about Kark Island and potentially the United States taking that over for the Iranian oil. How might that motivate people if the oil and gas prices continue to skyrocket?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Iranian government has always benefited from a complete lack of pressure, public pressure, for anything that they do, whether it's engage in a 12-day war with Israel, or whether they essentially sort of mobilize and enable its proxy networks to attack, Israel through Lebanon or through Gaza. It doesn't really make, or the Houthi network doesn't really sort of impact the domestic sort of situation in Iran in terms of the IRGC and the Islamic Republic face no significant public pressure from essentially how they choose to prosecute themselves on the international stage. We are a country that is fully accountable to essentially public opinion and public pressure, and we have regular elections. It is a midterm year, and obviously the United States public and the administration will be watching that carefully. We have multiple indicators. We're trying to battle inflation. We have issues with gas prices, which the American public is very sensitive to. And we have people that will question this. The longer this goes on, I think the more pressures that will bring upon the administration to essentially find a way to come out with this with a definable win that serves our national security interests, but also the stability of the region. And that is a pressure point which the Iranians know. And if they continue to sort of target tankers in the Gulf region there, or other critical oil infrastructure, or conversely, if either the Israelis or the United States, end up striking Iran's refining capabilities or any of the oil depots, these are significant pressure points on the global price of energy and oil and gas markets. So, it's important to watch out for that.
Is that what we're seeing on the video right here? Is Israel striking Iranian oil facilities there? We saw some of these, obviously, the black smoke, the flames in the sky as Israel, or I should say Iran, kind of knowing that the global choke point that is the Strait of Hormuz could put pressure on so many global factors, including the United States. Is this Israel's response? Are they trying to kind of hamper that ability for Iran right now?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say, just based on, I'm not a military expert, so I will just, say this is a somewhat speculation on my part. Just seeing where that essentially oil depot and refinery capacity, if it is, but the oil depot is itself, located, it seems to me the intention here is to really curtail the supply of energy and gasoline to Iranians themselves, and really undercut the regime's ability to essentially, bank on the fact that life in Iran can continue unabated. Again, this is a problem that the Iranian people will feel. And we saw similar Israeli experiences back in the 12-day war last year, when the Iranian missiles attempted to strike the refining capabilities as well as distribution capabilities in Israel, notably around the port of Haifa, where all of this infrastructure is heavily located in Israel. Luckily, most of those survived for the Israelis. But, if they take out refining or distribution capabilities in a country, then you're looking at essentially a ground stop for vehicular activity or energy generation. But, this is also just to show, how capable the Israelis are in terms of actually targeting critical infrastructure inside of Iran too.
All right, very good. Sinan Ciddi, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight. Obviously, a lot to get to here, just more than a week into this Operation Epic Fury and the conflict there in Iran. I appreciate it again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right.